During the last quarter of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century, the colonial British officials brought about far-reaching changes in all spheres of Indian life. The most sweeping of these changes were wrought in the agrarian sector. These changes were very complex in nature and often contradictory. Dismantling the old feudal structure, a new semi-feudal structure was gradually put in place. The peasants' traditional right to occupancy over land was abolished. Slowly but steadily, land became a commodity, alienable private property. The catchword for the early British colonialists in India was plunder. They aimed at extraction of the maximum surplus from the peasants' produce. Revenue and not the welfare of the peasants was what they were looking at. They introduced 3 different land revenue settlements in separate regions of India under their control. These, however, differed only in form and not in content. The ultimate policy was maximization of land revenue. In the preceding lecture, Professor Amit Bhattacharya had discussed the permanent settlement that was introduced in Bengal in 1793. It gave rise to a hitherto unknown form of landlordism based on ownership of estates. The peasants were shorn of their traditional right to occupancy over land. The new landlords almost became the masters of the peasants' lives. In the present lecture, Professor Bhattacharya will discuss 2 more forms of land revenue systems introduced by the British.
Ryotwari Settlement was introduced in Madras and Bombay presidencies. It is true that the company acquired land around Madras as early as 1750. In 1765, for some reason or other, it made no serious attempt at the direct collection of land revenue. They were busy probably in eastern India, more busy. And it was only after conquering the Baramahal and Salem districts from Tipu Sultan in 1792 that the company first attempted to administer the land revenue policy, and surveys were made in the countryside. Surveys of fields owned by or possessed by individual holders, assessing the land revenue on each holding, collecting the land revenue directly from the landholder, all these things had started. And this particular system owes a lot to Colonel Alexander Reed and Thomas Munro. This settlement, Ryotwari Settlement, was introduced in the Baramahal between 1792 and 1798, in Coimbatore in 1799, in some districts which were ceded to the company by the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1800, regions like Bellary, Anantapur, Kurnool, Kudappat, etc., and the Carnatic districts in 1801, meaning Nellore, North and South Arcot, Chittor, Madura, etc. Now, the first 2 decades of the 19th century saw repeated changes, and there were often unsuccessful experiments in the methods of collecting land revenue. And it was finally, it was left for Munro to reintroduce the Ryotwari Settlement throughout the Madras presidency during his period of governorship from 1820 to 27. That is why the period is 1820 to 27, though it started earlier, a bit earlier in different regions. Elphinstone, who was the governor of Bombay presidency, introduced it in 1819, sometime after the defeat of the Marathas. Now, the officials believed that in these regions there were no jamindars with large estates, and so there could be no jamindari settlement. So it was decided that a settlement should be made directly with the ryots, that is the peasants or the cultivators, and under this system the ryot was to be recognized as the owner of his plot of land, subject to the payment of land revenue, again subject to the payment of land revenue. And it was a temporary settlement, it was not a permanent settlement, and it was to be revised periodically after 20 years or 30 years. That was decided. Now in Madras, Monroe's new settlement fixed the land revenue at half the gross produce, 50%, on unirrigated dry lands, and 3/5 on irrigated wetlands. And the incidence of land revenue varied enormously from one district to another, and even from one village to another village. In Bombay, on the other hand, revenue assessment was not made, as in the case of Madras, on the basis of gross agricultural produce and calculations regarding the cost of production. In Bombay, fertility of land and market price of agricultural produces were given priority in assessing revenue upon the ryots. Now, under the Ryotwari settlement, the holding of the ryot, rather than a large feudal estate, became the basic unit. Holding of the ryot, small holding of the ryot, for the fixation of revenue. And it was raised from time, an amount, quantity was raised from time to time. And the demand was pitched so high that in the Bombay Presidency, for instance, peasants were subjected to cruel and revolting torture to force them to meet the revenue demand of the state. Coming to the Madras Presidency, we have R.C. Dutt. R.C. Dutt wrote that the use of torture was almost universal in the province for the realization from the extraction of land revenue from the primary producers of the soil. Now, however, what is important is that the Ryotwari settlement did not bring about a system of peasant ownership, though it was concluded with the peasants. And the peasants soon discovered that large numbers of jamindars were replaced by one giant jamindar, and that is the colonial state. It was the colonial state which was the jamindar, which appeared to be the jamindar, the largest jamindar. But as the land revenue was exorbitant, unbearable, they could not pay the amount, and so they had to part with their land, because that was the condition. You have to pay revenue on time, and unless that was done, then you will have to part with your land. That brings us to the last one, that is the Mahalwari Settlement, which was introduced in 1822. In fact, it was introduced, of course, later than Permanent Settlement, and a bit later than the Ryotwari Settlement also. Now, the northwestern provinces were acquired between 1801 and 1803 by cession and conquest. And this settlement was introduced in parts of central India, in the Punjab, and in the northwestern provinces. The first serious attempt in the settlement of revenue was made by a person named Holt Mackenzie, who was a secretary to the government in the territorial department. And it was he who had given shape to the Regulation 7 of 1822. And in one sense, it was Mahalwari Settlement was a modified version of the Permanent Settlement. According to that settlement, the land revenue was made neither with the great hereditary revenue farmers like the Bengal Jamindars, except in a few places. There are some exceptions also. Nor with the peasants, as in Madras and parts of Bombay Presidency. The new regulation permitted the government official to form settlement with all the co-sharers in mahals or estates, that is, who are the owners of the mahals, owners of the village communities, or a few representatives of the village community, or the heads of families or landlords. So there were many people who were associated with the mahal. So it was the settlement was made with the owners of the mahals, with the owners of the estates. And it was decided to fix assessment upon every field and upon every resident ryot. And the state's share was fixed at 83% of the gross rental. 83%, that was the quantity, that was the amount. And like other settlements also, the settlement of 1822 was also plagued by overassessment. There was much overassessment. And pressed from above by demands for increased revenue, the revenue officials, they always screwed the assessment up to the highest possible figure to extract the maximum surplus from the peasants. And here also the land revenue was periodically revised, and the peasants were subjected to same kind of oppression and torture. Now, there were three main features of the land revenue systems introduced by the British in three different regions of India. The first feature is that the land tax and the rent, which was appropriated by the British bourgeoisie through the colonial state machinery and its intermediaries, that is the native landlords and usurers, took not only the entire amount of the surplus labor, but also a part of the necessary labor of the peasant. And the peasant was not only ground down to the barest minimum of means of subsistence, but that barest minimum, he was also deprived of that barest minimum also. So everything of the surplus product and part of the necessary labor, necessary product, was also taken away from him. That is the first thing. It is applicable to all the three regions. The second is that the rent that the direct producers paid to the landlords and directly to the colonial state was not the capitalist land rent, which represented an excess over profit, but the typical ruthless feudal rent. No question of profit, everything. If an important part of the necessary labor, that was also taken away. And the third point is that the appropriation of the land tax and rent by the colonial state and the landlords was in the main coercive. It was forcefully taken away. Extra economic compulsion was there, and it became more and more intensified than ever before. Now, in the new climate, usury, money lending, experienced a phenomenal growth. We know that demands were made by the colonial state on the jamindars, on the peasants, on the owners of the mahals. And in order to meet the exorbitant revenue demand or rent, the peasants were forced to borrow money from the moneylenders. They were forced to do so. And in fact, the moneylender, the usurer, they made it comparatively easy for the peasants, both the peasants as also the landlords, to pay the revenue within the specified date, because they were there with the money. And usurers themselves were also landlords. Usurers, it is not that they were not landlords, but they were also landlords. In colonial India, usury capital sided with colonial power, and serviced a mechanism of tribute extraction. Side by side, it also caused disintegration of the small peasant economy and ruined both the peasants and the artisans. And there was no way to escape from the control of the moneylenders. Because whenever they were in need of money, they would have to look towards, they would have to borrow money. And the only person from whom they could borrow money was the moneylenders and nobody else. And in fact, he would rather get into debt by mortgaging his land than he would part with his own land. But once he was in debt, once he borrowed money, he became indebted, and once he was in debt, it was virtually impossible for him to get out of it because it would not be possible for him to pay off the debt. It is not that just the principal, but the interest amount. And the jamindars and the moneylenders, they also forged their signatures. And since they were illiterate, they didn't know what actually was written on the paper, on the piece of paper, where he signed, where he gave the thumb impression. He could not sign, he gave the thumb impression. And so the result was that after a point of time, he had to part with their land because he could not repay the money. This way, moneylenders became landlords, they became jamindars because they became the owners of the plots of land. So there was the parasitical growth of usury in the Indian countryside, and it led to debt bondage, some type of debt bondage. Now, besides bonded labor, a new kind of serfdom also arose in the countryside. With the penetration of commodity money relations into the countryside, the ownership of land was being increasingly transferred from one hand to another, from the peasants particularly to the hands of the usurer come landlords, new generation of landlords, traders. They were also traders, not just landlords. And when the peasants were forced to sell their holdings, or when they lost them to the mortgages, they were not driven off the land, but they were employed on the same land as sharecroppers. They were tilling the land, which at one time belonged to them, but now they knew that that land no longer belonged to them. It now belonged to someone else. And the usual landlords seized most of the products, all the surplus products, as also much of the necessary products, without virtually making an investment. So this type of parasitic landlordism flourished throughout India after the introduction of the three land settlements, the permanent, the Ryotwari and the Mahalwari.
Sir, what was the difference between the surplus product and the necessary product?
Necessary product or necessary labor. It is that part of the product which is necessary, which is the barest minimum needed for subsistence, for the peasant subsistence. And surplus product or surplus labor is that portion which is above that, that is, which is more than what was necessary for his own maintenance. That is, it is more than the barest minimum. It is more than the barest minimum. Now, the colonial rulers, they extracted the surplus product, total extraction, and also a part of the necessary product, which means that the barest minimum also, he was deprived also of part of the barest minimum. So it was not possible to maintain himself. In such a situation, it is not possible to maintain himself. So that was a typical feudal form of extraction, which leaves nothing for the peasant. Okay.
Sir, how far was the colonial rule beneficial?
when we dealt with the impact of dealt with the impact of the three settlements, we have seen that it can hardly be called beneficial, because the three land revenue settlements were made with the sole purpose of strengthening colonial rule. First of all, to have a stable source of land revenue, to extract more and more from the primary producers of the soil, and then also to create a pillar, one of the main pillars of colonial rule, so that they could strengthen colonial rule. They could give advice, suggestions, and they could protect colonial rule from attacks from other etc., other Indians also. So colonial rule can hardly be called, in this sense, it can hardly be called beneficial. And we have seen that the situation in the countryside was that there was the development of money lending, usury capital, debt bondage, then a new type of serfdom, and the destruction of the productive forces. Someone said that colonial rule would lead to the development of new productive forces. But how can new productive forces develop in a situation when there was nothing left for the primary producers of the soil? There was nothing left, hardly anything left. So this impact was totally negative. It was totally negative. If it was beneficial, then it was beneficial to the colonial state. It was beneficial to the collaborators of colonial states. It was beneficial, of course, to the Jamindars, but not to the basic masses, not to the people, because it was a development of the metropolis at the cost of the underdevelopment of India. So it can hardly be called beneficial for the Indian people. And now we will make a brief summing up of what we have analyzed so far. We have dealt with the three main settlements: the permanent settlement, the Ryotwari settlement, and the Mahalwari settlement. Three settlements in three different parts of the country. And we have argued that instead of playing any revolutionary role, all these settlements made the Indian society move further backwards rather than forward. Thank you.